Now we're going to start online discussion on the implication of the Ukraine crisis on energy market and the climate change discussion. And Ukraine crisis having a strong impact on the geopolitical landscape in Europe and globally, and also having a huge impact on the energy market and global commodity market. And it also impact on the energy strategy of European and US and other countries, including Japan, to diversify its energy sources. And also its impact on ongoing discussion on climate change. Today, we welcome two distinguished guests. The first guest is Sir Dieter HELM, professor at the Oxford University. He's an expert on the energy economics. And then we're going to have Professor ARIMA at the Tokyo University, Graduate School of Tokyo University. Everyone knows he's the expert on the energy policy in Japan and globally. So now we're going to start listen to Sir Dieter on his perspective on Ukraine crisis, on its impact on energy and climate change discussion.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you. What I'm going to do is, first of all, provide some context. Then I'm going to provide some comments precisely on Ukraine and the invasion. And then I'm going to make some remarks about looking through this crisis to what comes further on. And it is very important to distinguish from the word go the difference between crisis and crisis management and medium and longer term energy policy. And there are many, many past examples, particularly at the end of the 1970s, when a short-term energy crisis led to decisions which within 4 or 5 years turned out to be very ill considered. It's always the case that when oil and gas prices go up, people start assuming that they'll go on up forever and that what goes up can never come down. In the 1980s, the oil price collapsed from its peak in 79, and we inherited a whole set of policies on the assumption that oil prices would go up right through the 80s and 90s and beyond, and they virtually never ever got back to the level in real terms they were in 79. So I'm going to emphasize that key point. Now, that said, the commodity cycle and the rises of commodity prices across the board started well before Russia started its terrible invasion of Ukraine. They were rising at the end of last year, and this isn't confined to oil and gas. This is also a matter for agricultural markets where commodities were already going up, and then nickel, aluminium, steel, all sorts of other commodities were rising in prices. And that commodity price inflation, if you like, is the product of two things which are ongoing. The first is the recovery from the pandemic in a context in which supply chains have been seriously damaged during the pandemic itself. So all sorts of cost savings were made during the pandemic for companies to survive. This made them just in time and keeping their inventory stocks, ships, etc., at a minimum, and suddenly demand bursts back and supply can't respond and the price goes up. And that price going up, the commodity cycle going up, by the way, had a further component, which was this drive to disinvest from particularly fossil fuels by environmentalists, which meant that the oil and gas companies were not doing much capital investment in the last few years. So that's part of it. The other part of it was the extraordinary monetary and fiscal policies and quantitative easing, all of which are still going on. So in a country like the UK, the interest rate is 0.5%. It might rise to 0.75 later this week. The inflation rate is something like 8%, which means that the real interest rate is currently -7%. That's an extraordinary monetary stimulus, and much of the bond buying, etc., has not really come to an end across the developed world. We've never had a stimulus like this, and it would be unsurprising to find that such stimuli produce a lot of inflation, and particularly commodity price inflation. So all of that's going on, and the Russian invasion, the unprovoked and outrageous invasion of Russia into a sovereign country, happened in the teeth of that crisis. Mm. Now, that said, the invasion started in February, and that's a bit late in the winter to have the maximum effect on oil and gas markets in the Northern Hemisphere. And you know, it's March. Here in the UK, the sun's out today. We're going into spring. It's not exactly the optimal time for Russia to exploit the position in the West. It's got a stranglehold over particularly Germany, but there is some limit to it. So if we look at this, we have to not just ask ourselves what's going to happen next month and what's going to happen this summer. We have to ask what's going to happen in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years after this. Okay, and when I say after, it may be continuing civil war, internal resistance in Ukraine for a decade. Who knows? It might be over by Christmas. Putin might be deposed. There might be a revolution inside Russia, and then we'll all want to be friends with Russia, and suddenly we'll all be buying Russian oil and gas again. So you have to think about what the frame of this is, and we just don't know what those options look like. What we do know is that Russia is overwhelmingly dependent on oil and gas exports. We're talking about an economy that's, you know, probably smaller than Italy. We're not talking about a big economic power. We're talking about a small or relatively small economy which has oil and gas and a big military. And the military costs the oil and gas. In the short run, because the oil and gas prices gone up, there is a windfall to Russia, which helps finance its aggression, but that may not last going forward. And the consequence of that dependence on oil and gas is Russia needs to sell it. So for everyone who's in a position where they have to buy, Russia has to sell. It doesn't have the luxury of simply saying, you know what, we'll just keep the stuff and turn you off. If they turn off exports, the impact on the Russian economy will be dire. That said, they have an outlet called China. And that is very important to bear in mind. I do actually think that the upshot of this invasion of Ukraine, if Putin remains in power, I think that Russia will essentially become a vassal state of China. China needs a lot of natural resources. Russia has them: timber, iron ore, coal, oil, gas, and new pipelines. And pipelines aren't expensive to build, really, in the order of things. So it's not that Russia's not going to be able to sell some oil and gas. It's going to sell quite a lot to China and a lot more in the future. But then it'll find out what economic dependency in geopolitical terms really means. I doubt that's going to be deeply in the interests of either the Russian people or indeed the Russian elite, or what's left of it at the end of this episode. But in Europe, the biggest dependency is Germany, and the gas-oil relationship between Germany and indeed the raw materials relationship between Germany and Russia is at least 100, 150 years old. Right? That relationship, Russia sells essentially natural resources to Germany, and Germany provides machine tools, manufactured stuff, etc., is a bargain which goes right through the 20th century. Most notoriously in the Hitler-Stalin Pact, when essentially Germany, without its own domestic oil production, in order to support its military, needed a reliable source of supply. And it turned out then that Germany and Russia in 41, 42 wanted to divide up Poland as well. So both militarily and in terms of resources for German military in the Second World War, the relationship was core, but it goes right through a divided Germany with the Soviets occupying East Germany until the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt, and then the disgraceful engagement of Schroeder as head of the Social Democratic government in the early years of this century, and his approval of the Nord Stream pipeline, and then very quickly becoming chairman of that pipeline, and now becoming chairman of Rosneft. He represented what at the time was one deep strand of integration between Germany and Russia. That's split open. The biggest immediate geopolitical consequence of the invasion of Ukraine, apart from the Ukrainian people, of course, and the bombs falling on them, is that Germany has changed its foreign and energy policy probably more than any time since about 1948. So first of all, with the Greens inside government as a key part of the government, they've delayed the closure of nuclear power stations, and there's even some speculation of trying to reopen some of the recently closed nuclear power stations, and they have gone from a fairly pacifistic position to one of not only aspiring to 2% of GDP. And remember, German GDP is big, so it's a lot of money in defense, but also the supply of arms to the Ukrainian people in their valiant defense of their country. This is huge. And they will try to prune themselves off Russian gas. They're building a new LNG plant, and these are very interesting, hydrogen ready. So a more long-term geopolitical effect in Europe is that hydrogen has been given a huge boost, especially in Germany. But if the Putin regime was to collapse, it would invert back to it was. Now, just looking just finally in these opening remarks to the broader issues of the impact on climate change, in the short run, it's very bad. So it's a switch from gas to coal. And already we had a big increase in coal burn in China anyway. The world is a very long way from any aspiration to address climate change seriously. 80% of the world economy is provided by oil, gas, and coal. We tend to think about wind farms and so on in the electricity sector, but most of our economies are fueled by fossil fuels. The rest is a bit of nuclear and a bit of hydro. Oh, and I think 1.5% of renewables of the wind and solar and so on. So the push in those territories to expand nuclear and to expand wind, etc., they will be spurred on by what's happened. But in the bigger scheme of things, if we carry on adding 2 parts per million per annum to the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, as we have done for the last 30 years, and as we did last year, despite the lockdowns and the emissions reductions, that concentration of emissions in the atmosphere keeps going on up. And after 25 or 26 COPs, we're no closer to stopping the increase of that concentration. And that's why I'm very skeptical of those who think that, COP26 in Glasgow, this is the turning point. Go back and look at each of the COPs, take the speeches, change the date, change the name of the president of America or whoever at the time, and you get the same result. We ain't going to crack climate change that way. We have to crack it. And the big story in the medium term out of what's recently happening is nuclear is having a big reappraisal, and hydrogen has come a long way up the scale. And with that, CCS, carbon storage, has also got a big lift. That's just by way of introduction. It's just a sketch of some of the issues at stake. But I repeat what I said at the start, don't mistake crisis management for energy policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Dieter, for very holistic explanation of what is happening and also the distinction between crisis and crisis management. So I think you will remark on the strategic change in Germany happening is quite significant. And yeah, thank you very much. Now, Professor Arima, it's a turn to.
Okay, thank you very much, Watanabe-san, and thank you very much, Dieter, for your very much insightful, the analysis. And let me also share my perspective about the impact of Ukraine war on energy security and climate change. And I think, we could imagine multiple impact on energy and climate policies around the world. In a nutshell, it would be inevitable to see a delay in clean energy transition. In the energy policy debate, in the recent 10-15 years, excessive priority was placed on climate change while taking supply security for granted. Ukrainian war will bring supply security back to the top agenda for many countries. And yes, EU has put forward very laudable policy for energy independence from Russia while pursuing clean energy transition simultaneously. This is always the case, I sense, in the climate circle. The statement is immaculate, but actual implementation does not match always. And supply shortage of Russian oil and natural gas could mean additional supply from US and Qatar, but that will not be sufficient. So I think high gas and electricity price will lead to a strong incentive to continuous use of coal for the sake of supply security and affordable energy prices in such countries as Germany, Poland, and other Eastern European countries. And that will definitely slow down mitigation efforts. The impact will be further acute in Asian countries where they are still heavily dependent on coal, and high natural gas in the international market will discourage switching from coal to natural gas in these countries. And natural gas, by the way, was regarded as relatively low-hanging fruit for Asian countries for lower emission future. So that will definitely have a big impact on global mitigation efforts. Moreover, the economic downturn and inflation pressure is anticipated as an aftermath of the Ukrainian war. Under that situation, willingness to pay for higher energy costs will dwindle, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. And I fully agree with Sir Dieter in your past statement that the government should be honest about the green inflation and anticipated energy price hike caused by green policies. And that kind of price hike will never be welcomed in the difficult economic situation. And even before Ukrainian war, priority on climate action is much lower in developing countries. According to the My World 2030, it's a global poll conducted by United Nations. In Sweden, climate action is without question top priority. In China, 15th out of 17 SDGs. In Russia, 9th out of 17 SDGs. So the priority differs from country to country. And this situation will further exacerbate as a result of Ukrainian war. And a financial transfer promised at COP26 will be far, far less than expected due to higher military expenses in developed countries. So COP27 in Egypt this year will be particularly acrimonious, I anticipate. And environmental activists are strongly arguing for accelerated phase out of fossil fuels and complete phase out of nuclear. But it is suicidal for many countries, as presented by German case. And for Japan, reoperating nuclear power plants will be the most feasible option for energy security and greenhouse gas emission reduction simultaneously. And we will certainly promote renewable energy as well. But we need to be careful about high dependence on Chinese renewable energy products and strategic minerals, in which China has a strong strong direct or indirect influence. And China will enjoy cheap supply of Russian oil and natural gas, as pointed out by Sir Dieter. They will export PV, windmill, battery, and EV to developed countries, and coal-fired power plants to developing countries, which are both suffering from higher energy prices. And too hasty introduction of intermittent renewable will just turn out to be a grist for China's mill. More broadly, global political and economic order will not go back to a pre-Ukrainian war situation, to my mind. There will be a new Cold War between authoritarian states such as China and Russia and Western democratic states. Such confrontational situation is not conducive to climate change agenda, calling for true international collaboration. But nevertheless, we need to sustain our efforts, endeavor for long-term decarbonization, and we should speed up more on innovative technologies, in particular CCUS and hydrogen, as rightly pointed out by Sir Dieter. But we should also recognize that 45% reduction global emission by 2030, as promoted in Glasgow, is just a pipe dream to my mind. I will stop here and looking forward to having an active discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor ARIMA. The crisis has certainly implications for the climate change and the discussion and the green policy in every corner around the world. But thank you very much for your insight. And if I may back to Sir Dieter on the prospect of energy market and the commodity market. And at the beginning, you mentioned the distinction between crisis and crisis management. So oil and gas price will rise, but may come down. Of course, it will depend how the crisis, and when and how the crisis ends in Ukraine. But what's your perspective on the energy market and in this inflationary environment you mentioned earlier?
So no energy policy should ever be designed on the assumption you know what future energy prices will be. So I give you an example. Our Secretary of State in the UK said that it was a good idea to build new nuclear power stations to avoid high and volatile gas prices. And you think, what's that mean? So he knows that in 2035, when such nuclear power stations would, the earliest date they would come onto the system, he knows in 2035 that the oil and gas price, particularly the gas price, can be high and volatile. Why? Right? So this is an example of you must be very careful. You've got to have a crisis management for high prices today, and especially affordability, as was mentioned, is a very important political component of this. And you have to manage security today where there are real tight constraints. But if you look out over the decade to come, and this is one of the reasons why addressing climate change is so difficult, we have a world which is awash with potential gas supplies, awash with potential oil supplies, and has, for all practical purposes, infinite coal supplies. And what we know is that the costs of production, even of shale gas in the United States, or shale oil, and shale has a particular cost profile, have come tumbling down. We know the Middle East has a marginal cost of oil of about $2 to $5 a barrel, and we know Russia's marginal cost of production is probably about 20. So it takes time for supply to respond to demand, as was very clearly set out. All sorts of countries are now going to develop oil resources. Uganda is another example of a country in the developing world pushing forward. Mozambique, Angola, we've got plenty of potential sources. You've just got to get through the cycle to get there. The one twist that's slightly different is that shale technologies are very fast. Okay? You can literally design the capex, the capital expenditure in shale, on the future price of oil. Okay? And so it's a faster reaction. But a cycle, what's it going to take? 4 or 5 years? Right? The price itself, markets work, price is destroying demand all over the place. Substitutions are happening, as pointed out, to coal. And these were happening long before Russia invaded Ukraine. Then the other side of the equation is there are lots of people running around saying renewables are the cheapest source of electricity generation. No, generally they're not. Once you take into account their intermittency. It's true their marginal cost is zero, but nothing follows from that. And as again was very correctly pointed out, the components for electric cars, for wind turbines, for solar panels, many of which are dependent on China, are rising in price extremely fast. And so we're going to have an inflation, yes, but the real price of the fossil fuels, in my mind, will in due course return to the path that it's had for 100 years, which is a gradual, slow fall in its real price, which is attached to a gradual, slow fall in the real costs of production. And so I expect over time the oil and gas prices to do what they always do, which is fall back to some normal balance of supply and demand. And were Russia to go through an internal revolution, were Putin to be disposed, having gone through all of these efforts now, and then have Russia come back into the market on top of all of that lot, it's not inconceivable we could see in a few years' time a price collapse of oil and gas. Now, I don't know whether that's going to happen. I wouldn't design energy policy on it, but I certainly would not design energy policy on the assumption that oil and gas prices are going to remain high, volatile forever, and right through to 2035 and be the framework for deciding whether to build nuclear power stations or whatever.
Thank you very much for your answer. Arima-san, any comments?
Yes, a very interesting comment. And first of all, in the case of Japan, we have already built nuclear power reactors, which are not operating now. So I think reoperating nuclear power is fully logical conclusion for Japan. But the new construction of nuclear, yes, that is challenging because it has a longer lead time. And also, as you rightly pointed out, we don't know the future oil and gas prices. So my question to Sir Dieter is, do you think that the current Ukrainian, the war or crisis will accelerate or derail energy transition to clean energy future? What is your bet?
So my take on that is that it's, and you might think it's a cop-out, but it's complicated. So there are some technologies which are in the green camp and they enhance security. So it's always got to be the case that any decarbonisation policy follows the path which is also meeting security. And because most of the renewables technologies are low density, disaggregated, intermittent technologies. The reason I described what's going on at the moment, actually before Russia's invasion, as the first net zero energy price crisis, because it's very important, because in order to back up the renewables, you need a lot of gas. And one of the ironies of what's happened in this price cycle is that the UK, which imports virtually no gas from Russia, right, has been hit very hard. And part of that's because it got out of coal, but part of it's because it needs gas as its main source of producing electricity to back up the renewables, but the intermittent renewables make the gas intermittent too, and therefore raise the costs of that gas. So for some parts of the decarbonisation path, in particular the nuclear component, I don't read anything other than, in inverted commas, good news for nuclear out of this. So it's not just a question of but it's dramatic. Germany's change of heart with these existing nukes, and perhaps Japan's as well. It's also a turn to small modular reactors and new nuclear. And, in the UK, we look across to France. 70 to 80% of its electricity is produced from nuclear. Much of the rest is hydro. And therefore, the French government, much to the anger of EDF, the French company, can limit price increases to customers of 4%. Right? Because costs haven't gone up in France. Okay. Now, of course, EDF could have sold its electricity at the marginal cost of gas, right? But that would have been a windfall profit to the French government because the French government owns most of EDF. So it does give you an example of what kind of insurance is bought by having baseload low carbon energy. And the other component of this is to remember that in all of this excitement at the moment, if we look at the technologies coming into the market going forward, a lot of them are zero marginal cost. That requires a rethink of electricity in particular markets to see it more as capacity and less as energy, because the energy itself is free. And that's been true of nuclear too. But, if you want to do something about climate change, climate change is going to be determined largely in China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa. These are the places it occurs. But in one foul swoop, as Germany has discovered, restarting existing nuclear power stations is a big potential for addressing some of climate change. I understand all the sensitivities and all the arguments around nuclear power, but purely from a climate change point of view, the question to ask is, why wouldn't you do that? And that's what even the German Greens have discovered.
Sir Dieter, let me make one correction, because according to the most recent news from Germany, the Federal Ministry of Economics and Climate Protection and the Ministry of Environment jointly published a report that they do not recommend, the postponement of nuclear phase out. So it seems to me that Germany will close down nuclear as planned.
That may be the latest announcement, but remember, this is a crisis and things develop day by day. The big change in Germany is deeply a political psychology. Okay? And that, and if you look at the opinion polls more generally, etc., has changed the noise around this. So as long as German industry is quietly going on importing all that gas from Russia. So there's lots of noise about weaning itself off Russian gas, but as long as it's actually getting that gas and on long-term contracts, so it's not paying the current spot price of that gas, German industry might be complicit or compliant with closing those existing nuclear power stations. But if the pressure ratchets up, and it's happening on a daily basis, and German companies find themselves much more exposed, then, what are they going to do? And therefore, German government had different ministries making different kinds of recommendations. I'm interested in decisions, and I don't see anyone rushing with a workforce to close those existing nuclear power stations as fast as they possibly can. And I don't see any demonstrators outside saying, close this plant immediately. That's changed. And the Greens are part of the government. It's very important.
Yeah, I think it's very significant in Germany that in the new government crisis is happening, and the German government is trying to find a new direction in energy policy. That's a significant change in terms of energy policy as well as geopolitical policy for Germany and Europe. Arima-san, do you have any further comment?
Yes, and then Sir Dieter, let me ask the question, because you are the great fan of CBAM, carbon border adjustment measures for combating, consumption-based CO2 emissions. And then the landscape of energy and climate change is very much heavily affected by ongoing Ukrainian war. And then under that situation, how this CBAM discussion will play out, because the possible target of CBAM was Russia and Ukraine steel, and electricity coming from Russia but two of them are in the conflict now. And also the US, looking at the current congressional situation, it is not likely that US will have explicit carbon price. So therefore, it will be very much difficult for having a transatlantic alliance of CBAM. So how do you see the future of CBAM under the current geopolitical situation?
So two parts to the answer to that question. The first one is CBAMs are the right answer. Because if you want to stop causing climate change, it's an absolute nonsense to address climate change domestically and have all the costs that go with it, damage your existing domestic industry compared with imports. And the UK is the case par example. You know, we're 80% services now. We import, you know, our fertilizer, our aluminium, our steel, our petrochemicals. Anybody who wants to produce steel in the UK has to pay a carbon price, but if it's imported from China, they don't. It's basically a subsidy to your competitors. And that's why territorial carbon production targets in net zero terms don't achieve the claimed objective of stopping you causing climate change. In fact, they can make things worse. And as I say in the UK, if you want to get the COP26, the NDCs down fast in Britain, just close down the last 6 refineries, close down the last bit of the steel industry, close down the big petrochemical plant in Grangemouth, and hope that Brexit finishes off the car industry. Do those things today, and you will really be the climate change heroes. Not. Because you'll just import that stuff from countries like China. And that's the corollary of this. You know, if you look at where the carbon intensive trading is coming from, it is actually coming from countries like China and Russia, right? And that's why they are so vehemently opposed to these, because it gives them a competitive advantage. And you can see it in other areas. You know, you take some of the rare metals and nickels, all sorts of things, okay? Mining them in China, using coal energy to do this, and then exporting them for so-called renewables in other countries is a great game. It's actually very, very damaging to the climate. And one of the reasons why we haven't diversified to produce these minerals elsewhere and not rely on China is precisely because we've effectively given them a carbon subsidy to do it there. So it's the right answer. Now, the second question is, will it happen? Okay. And there you come up against the deep vested interests and lobbying, which is part and parcel of political life. So the US, it's always struck me that in the end, they will end up with a carbon price, just like Europe and elsewhere already have. Why? Because they need the money. They've run out of a tax base. The second thing to say is there are loads of carbon prices out there already. So the current oil price is largely an OPEC carbon tax. Marginal cost of production, 5, the price 110. That is a implicit carbon tax of $105 a barrel, right? So that's why I always think the carbon price should be inverse to the oil price, by the way. That you should move those two, okay? And then the other bit of the politics is it depends who the losers are. If the losers turn out to be China and Russia, as the world splits apart down this, it's not the old Cold War in Europe, it's a Cold War globally between these blocks. If that's what happens, then essentially, instead of putting import tariffs on China as imports, you could have a much better way of doing it, which is to put it on the pollution content of those imports. So I don't despair, but the longer it goes on of not choosing this option because it is the right answer, the worse climate change will be. And you can pursue an unsustainable set of policies. That's what we're doing in respect to climate change. But you can't escape the consequence of that, which is that it will not be sustained. And we're well on course for 2 degrees, and 3 degrees looks to me to be, the new aspiration we're going to go to soon, because COP26 achieved very little on that path.
And I think that targeting Russia is relatively easier. Now Russia is a villain, but targeting China could be more complicated for such a country as Germany, because China is a big market for Germany. So there could be a strong opposition even from developed countries to target other China.
Yeah, and in the German case, one of the little known features of the German government is that the Greens are very, very keen on human rights.
Yeah.
And therefore, their foreign policy has always been much tougher on China and much tougher on Russia. The Uyghur issue, the concentration camps in northwest China, etc., are matters of deep concern to the Green Party. And that shapes the nature of that government. But my guess is that this dependency of countries like Germany on Chinese exporting to China, just like the dependency of German industry on Russian gas, both of those have had a nasty shock. And I see globalization continuing the retreat that's been going on for the last 5 to 10 years, and I expect that to get reinforced. This notion of kind of energy independence is just too far-fetched, just like it is about economic independence. But I think the shortening of supply chains, the reshoring, and especially in a world where labor costs don't matter so much because it's digital, it's about it's a shift to capital away from labor. Location, I think, is a lot less important going forward. I think Europe has the potential to become a serious manufacturing base again. And that's because I think we haven't understood the basic underlying technology change that's taking place. Big data, AI, machine learning, production activities by robots, no need for humans. I mean, there's all sorts of social consequences of that. But this old idea which led to the historic transformation of China, of cheap labor, it's over. And I genuinely think Chinese economic growth is over too. You know, I remember the 1980s when we thought the future was entirely Japanese. we imported any idea from Japan to learn how to do it. And miracles come to an end. And the Chinese miracle is coming to an end. And I think that's going to also be reinforced in Europe.
Like Paul Kennedy, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Dieter and Professor ARIMA, for very insightful and wonderful perspective. We learned a lot from the discussion and your presentation. And thank you again for taking us your busy time and precious thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sir Dieter, and then I hope to see you in person next time in London. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Bye now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.